Hello, I'm Katia Dupret and I'm the head of the research project Socially Innovative Knowledge Work based in Denmark. It's a multi-stakeholder research project investigating trends and dilemmas among knowledge workers in their workplaces. It comprises both statistical labor market analysis and in-depth case studies and subsequent digital gamification of work-life dilemmas. In all three case studies, we see different ways that the common good and the wider purpose of work becomes an important aspect of both selecting the job and being motivated in the job. So this talk presents some of the dilemmas of wanting to make a sustainable difference in the world and doing this with your whole existential self in ways that at times may compromise both your health and your ability or willingness to reflect on the work conditions internally in your organization. And the quote that you see here is a manager in a non-profit organization that says you can either finish doing your job and make a difference in the world, or you can choose to go home. The quintessence of the dilemma here. So this part of the research is based on a case study consisting of in-depth interviews and focus group interviews with both management and employees. And the non-profit festival organization is a workplace that is built around a huge annual event arranging the second biggest music festival in Europe. The festival was established in 1971, and ever since its origin it is founded on values of sustainability and democracy and inclusion. The organization is a non-profit social enterprise, and the profit solely serves humanitarian purposes, and this is an inherent part of the DNA of the organization. The staff consists of different types of flexible employments and also long-term employment. Out of approximately 90 tenured staff, approximately 10% are knowledge workers in temporary positions. In summertime, there is additionally 30,000 volunteers, of which 2,450 people volunteer more than 100 hours during the entire year, and not only during up to the festival. In addition to scaling up and down in staff in relation to the annual cycle, the organization also expands product repertoire and does not only develop the festival, but all sorts of services and consultancy work all year around. The case organization is interesting because the social sustainability purpose that is embedded in the case put at stake how much you do at work at the same time also creates a limit to what change one does in the world. So what we look at in this paper is that purpose is actually present in nearly every organization's yearly report or mission statement, but that purpose in recent years become revitalized as an important strategy for organizations to enhance trustworthiness and transparency between their mission and their action. And we'll add that there is a new logic of purpose that is emerging. First, that organizational scholars typically refer to purpose as organizationally and managerially defined, which is inviting for an approach that is exploring purpose as a concept focusing on the intersections between the individual and the organizational level. And secondly, in addition to a purely commercially defined purpose, purpose is to an increasing degree connected with doing good in society. So, to quote, purpose represents an overarching commitment to society that includes broader aims such as making a difference or improving lives or reducing harm. And purpose acknowledges the interdependence of business and society, as one cannot flourish without the other. And this is a quote from Hollensby et al. From 2014. So we suggest that there is a close link between the subjective sense of purpose in working lives and the sustainability agenda that organizations take on board. So unfortunately, in spite of the greater inclusion of sustainability in the definition of organizations' purposes, we still see a primary focus on the output of the organization and not on the human factor, or what is also called social sustainability, for example, well-being, equality and solidarity within the organization. Rather, management and organization studies has to a great extent looked upon the possible links between profitability and sustainability, as well as the factors that cause organizations to pursue different sustainability strategies. Even when there is a concern with how the formulation of organizational purpose has social effects, these concerns are mostly directed to the consequences of economic development and resource exploitation, rather than the consequences on every staff member's health and well-being and the richness of social life, as, for example, assessed by participation in meaningful civic activities. So we should look at the balancing of the outer sustainability purpose with the inner, and this presentation focuses on how employees shape and are shaped by conditions of work in strongly purpose-driven organizations. Despite improved living standards and wealth in general, researchers in industrialized countries have registered a sense of increasing work intensification. This is surprising because the quality of work life was predicted to be improved with less hours of work, more holiday and better work conditions. Work intensification is connected to the experience of an increased complexity in skill requirements, tight deadlines, and increased task flexibility. And an increase in the pace of work has been attributed to deteriorating workplace health. Specifically within knowledge work, work intensification is increasingly self-driven and influenced by subjectification processes in the context of trends of individualization and self-management that explains this group's increased experience with work intensification. Consistent with the stress of higher status hypothesis, Michel 2014 and Lupu and Empson in 2015 have highlighted how very qualified knowledge workers with apparent high levels of autonomy work beyond their limits, burning out and severely harming their health and personal relationships. These workers frequently refer to their activities and efforts as self-chosen, an emerging contradiction that is beginning to be known as the autonomy paradox. So we use a governmentality studies approach to investigate how employees' narratives of doing greater good in the world also becomes a productive self-disciplining strategy that potentially increases work intensification and simultaneously result in an instrumentalization of working for greater sustainability. The intersection between doing greater good in the world and the self-disciplining that comes along with it in some situations create dilemmas that may decrease well-being of employees, as it demands a continuous negotiation of boundaries between paid work and free time, meaningfulness and work devotion, self-management and work intensification, with negative health effects. A paradoxical saying is that the more self-control and freedom the employees experience, the more productive they are, and they will in turn give more of themselves. When working in a purpose-driven organization, the norms of sustainability becomes part of the moral imperative of conduct formulated in the technologies of power and likewise in the technologies of self that may raise new type of inherent conflicts. The moral imperatives of doing good creates different kinds of social dynamics to be handled. And these are the social dynamics we aim to shed light on in the analysis. So here you see some slides with examples of the interviews with employees And the highlights in red is actually the point that we are taking further in the analysis, but you get the context if you're reading it through. So this example is about constant availability, but also that this is the way it is supposed to be when wanting to include multiple stakeholders and volunteers that are not available at office hours. And aiming for social sustainability creates new working practices. So employees express that the development of the organization is creating less and less possibilities for counteracting periods of high demands, as the organization, to an increasing extent, take on board shorter-term projects the whole year round, but also one is supposed to be available 24/7. But that is part of the game. If you don't like it, maybe that's not where you should be. That's what the person expresses. So the next example is adding to this point about constant connectivity. But here what is interesting is that the employment status is adding an important dimension to this. So when people are shifting employment status from being a volunteer to maybe get a short-term contract, to maybe get tenure, long-term contract, things are adding to the necessity of work intensification, etc. So the boundaries of work and voluntary work and social life is evaporating once going from volunteering to getting a full-time contract. And the demand of managing one's freedom and saying no to being available at all times is increasingly difficult, as the fundamental social dynamics and practices in the organization require very strong relations with the stakeholders supporting the democratic and inclusive values of the organization. So the change in employment status seemed to actually also adding to the work intensification, both in terms of relational work, but also in the difficulty in self-managing the boundaries of work and non-work. So this next example, this is about when people are working in an organization very purpose-driven and where they invest their own self tremendously. They are working with their heart. This may deteriorate health, but actually it's also motivating. But in this respect, it risks nullifying both the critical reflexivity directed toward what is healthy in terms of one's own personal self, but also in terms of whether employees are raising reflective concerns about their own work conditions and how they should be handled. So when organizations have a strong sustainability purpose, this may be glorified in ways that employees tend to initially accept and maybe even prevent them from raising organizational resistance and critique. We also do find positive elements of self-technologies and self-subjectification processes. Doing good and doing it a lot seems to be boosting one's self-esteem. And this organization, we should say, it is highly, it is a place where people would really like to work, and there is a very nice atmosphere, etc. So this is an example, a positive example. And one can argue that this type of self-technology is nurtured by a kind of self-assessment that is dependent on how much one is doing good to others. And Lemke, in 2001, he points to the fact that tools to enhance self-esteem is to continuously be measured, judged, and disciplined in comparison to collective goals. And in this example, the collective goals are both ethically and existentially determined and goes beyond the culture of the organization, but is also in alignment with it. So they are determined by norms of social sustainability. It means that this organization, but also a more universal ethic, is about collaborating with volunteers. There is a solidarity and equality dimension that is part of both this organization's culture and practices, but also in a wider sense. So while it is often argued that self-esteem in neoliberal societies is closely tied to ideologies of neoliberalism through consumption, like, for example, self-help books, the boosting of self-esteem through aspirations and actions of doing good in relation to others does not make the individualistic and measurement dimension of self-discipline practices go away. But it adds an interesting dimension of solidarity. And we hereby see an extension of how self-esteem is not only connected to a personal, individualistically defined motivation, but also this solidarity and sustainability agenda and a wish to contribute to a common good. So all in all, we find that working with purpose to motivate and to increase work productivity, this is not new, but the increase in the focus on sustainability opens new possibilities of staff working hard with their hearts, but also has consequences that we have shown a couple of examples of. And we cannot be sure that the organizations are truly sustainable just because the vision or end product and services of it is. And it's ironic that we work so hard for sustainability, or at least some organizations do, but may be biased in taking care of our own work conditions. So, for example, this risk of critical reflexivity may disappear when we are aiming at organizing for sustainability, and also the different dilemmas of work, non-work, and etc. may be deteriorated. On the positive side, this response to hyper-individualism, even if the self-realization projects are maintained, there is also an aim of solidarity, which is very positive. And I would very much like to hear your input on how we can bring this paper further and how your thoughts could be in terms of systematizing the analysis. And I look very much forward to the discussion. See you there.